In 1996, United States Senator John McCain sent a letter to the governors of all 50 states asking them to ban a sport he described as, and I'm quoting directly here, human cockfighting. The sport was the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC. At the time, it was available in only a handful of states. Cable and pay-per-view providers were refusing to carry it. Politicians across the country were lining up to condemn it. The mainstream media treated it as a freak show, and the organization itself was hemorrhaging money at a rate that suggested it would not survive another few years. That was 1996. In 2016, the UFC sold for $4.025 billion. At the time, the largest acquisition of a sports franchise in history. Today, it is valued at somewhere between $12 and $15 billion. It is broadcast in 175 countries. Its biggest events sell out arenas in minutes and generate pay-per-view buys in the millions. Its athletes are some of the most recognized sports stars on the planet, and the sport that a United States senator called human cockfighting is now a mainstream, globally televised, corporate-sponsored entertainment product watched by hundreds of millions of people. How? How do you take something that the entire establishment is trying to kill, that is literally being banned state by state, and turn it into a $12 billion empire? The answer is one of the greatest business stories ever told, and it starts with two brothers from Las Vegas and a man named Dana White. In January 2001, Station Casino's owners Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta purchased the UFC for $2 million. Yes, $2 million. That's how close to worthless the organization was. They brought in their childhood friend Dana White as president, giving him a minority stake in the company. The three of them were getting something that most people considered unsalvageable. The first thing they did was incorporate the business properly. Under the previous ownership, the UFC had operated with minimal corporate structure. There was no real licensing framework, no unified brand standards, no strategic plan. It was essentially a series of violent events held whenever possible in whatever states would allow it. The Fertittas and White started from scratch. They rebranded, they restructured, they professionalized every aspect of the operation, from production quality to fighter contracts to media relations. And then they went to work on the thing that was killing the UFC more than anything else: its image. The human cockfighting problem was not just a PR issue. It was a regulatory issue. As long as the UFC was seen as an unregulated, dangerous spectacle, states would not sanction it. And if states would not sanction it, the major pay-per-view providers would not carry it. And if the major providers would not carry it, the UFC could not generate the revenue it needed to survive. So they made a calculated decision to embrace regulation, rather than fight it. They worked with the Nevada State Athletic Commission to develop a unified set of rules for mixed martial arts, rules that would govern the sport consistently, provide safety standards, and give regulators the framework they needed to sanction events. The unified rules of MMA, formalized around 2001, were largely shaped by the UFC's lobbying and collaboration with athletic commissions. This is a counterintuitive business lesson. Most companies in a hostile regulatory environment fight regulation. They spend money on lobbyists, they challenge rules in court, they try to minimize oversight. The UFC did the opposite. They ran toward regulation, they helped write the rules. They turned what should have been a constraint into a competitive advantage, because once they had helped establish the regulatory framework, they understood it better than anyone, and they used it to legitimize their product in ways that made them almost impossible to compete with. By 2002, Nevada had sanctioned MMA. Other states followed. The pay-per-view providers came back, and the UFC was for the first time operating as a real business with a real future. But legitimacy alone doesn't build an empire. The next move was the one that truly changed everything. In 2005, the UFC had a problem. They had invested in a TV deal with Spike TV to air a reality show called The Ultimate Fighter. The show featured 16 mixed martial artists competing for a UFC contract. And the first few episodes had weak ratings. The UFC was burning through cash. The show looked like it might fail completely. Dana White made a call to Spike TV executives. He asked them to air the season finale, the final fight between the two competitors, live and for free on television. Spike said yes, and on April 9, 2005, Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar fought one of the most dramatic, bloody, back-and-forth fights in UFC history, live on cable television, seen by millions of people who had never watched MMA before. The phones at the UFC offices didn't stop ringing for weeks. It was a moment that UFC insiders still call the fight that saved the organization. Not because Griffin and Bonnar were the best fighters in the world. But because the fight was real, it was raw, it was genuinely unpredictable, and millions of people watching it for free got to experience what MMA actually was. Not the cartoon violence that politicians had described, but two human beings pushing themselves to the absolute limit of their physical and mental endurance. The Ultimate Fighter ran for multiple seasons after that. Each season built the UFC's mainstream credibility. Each season introduced new athletes who became stars. Each season expanded the audience. And here is where the UFC's business model reveals its true genius. Unlike traditional sports leagues, the NBA, the NFL, the Premier League, the UFC does not have franchises. There is only one UFC. Dana White and the Fertittas made a deliberate decision never to sell territorial rights, never to create independently owned regional franchises, never to dilute the brand. This means the UFC owns everything. Every event, every broadcast right, every piece of content ever filmed inside a UFC octagon, every fighter's promotional rights during the term of their contract. When you sign with the UFC as a fighter, you are not signing with a team that then operates within a larger league. You are signing with the promoter, the broadcaster, the brand, and the rights holder all in one. The UFC is simultaneously your employer and your media company, and your pay-per-view distributor. This creates an enormous amount of leverage for the organization and a correspondingly complex situation for the fighters, a topic that has generated significant controversy and ongoing legal battles around fighter pay and classification. But from a pure business architecture standpoint, it is extraordinarily powerful. The UFC retains control over its entire value chain. It captures revenue at every point, and the brand remains singular, coherent, and impossible to replicate. Compare that to boxing, which operates in the opposite way. Boxing has multiple promoters, multiple sanctioning bodies, multiple championship titles, no unified broadcast deal, and no single entity that controls the sport. The result is a fractured, confusing product that even hardcore fans struggle to navigate. And the commercial value of boxing as a sport, despite having some of the most famous athletes in the world, is a fraction of the UFC's value. The UFC understood something that boxing never did. In the attention economy, clarity is a competitive advantage. One organization, one championship, one set of rules, one clear narrative of who is the best in the world. Now let's talk about the media strategy, because this is where the UFC truly separated itself from every other combat sports organization. In 2019, the UFC signed a 5-year deal with ESPN worth approximately $1.5 billion. This deal moved the UFC's primary television product to ESPN and ESPN+, giving it the full weight of Disney's media machine behind it. The deal was transformative not just because of the money, but because of what the ESPN brand did for the UFC's mainstream legitimacy. If you are on ESPN, you are a real sport. You are in the same conversation as the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball. You are not a fringe product for hardcore enthusiasts. You are mainstream American sports entertainment. And the UFC didn't just rely on the ESPN deal. They built one of the most sophisticated content operations in sport. UFC content is everywhere. Fight breakdowns on YouTube, fighter documentaries, behind-the-scenes access, historical fights available on demand. The UFC understands that content is not just programming. Content is relationship. Every piece of content is a chance to deepen a fan's connection to a fighter, to a storyline, to the sport itself. This is something Dana White talks about constantly. The idea that the UFC is not in the business of selling fights. It's in the business of creating stars. Because stars sell fights. Conor McGregor didn't just sell millions of pay-per-view buys because he was a great fighter. He sold them because he was one of the most compelling characters in sports entertainment. Someone who could sell a fight with a press conference, with a social media post, with a look across a room. The UFC's job at its core is talent development and storytelling. Find extraordinary athletes, build their profiles, create rivalries and narratives, and then monetize those narratives through pay-per-view, live gates, sponsorship, and broadcast deals. It is, in many ways, the same model as professional wrestling, but with real competition. The theatricality is genuine athletic achievement. The drama is real, and that combination, real stakes, real athletic excellence, wrapped in compelling narrative, is extraordinarily powerful. So, what can you take from all of this? The first lesson: legitimacy is a strategy, not just a byproduct. The UFC didn't wait to become legitimate before expanding. They made legitimacy their first priority and built the expansion on top of it. They identified the single biggest obstacle to their growth: regulatory hostility, and they systematically dismantled it by running toward the problem rather than away from it. Whatever business or career you're building, identify your legitimacy problem. Solve it first. Everything else gets easier once people take you seriously. The second lesson: control your narrative or someone else will. For years, the UFC's narrative was human cockfighting. Politicians and media defined the sport, and they defined it as dangerous and disreputable. Dana White and the Fertittas took back the narrative through The Ultimate Fighter, through mainstream broadcast deals, through deliberate media relationships, through creating stars who are compelling human beings first and fighters second. The moment you cede control of your story, you are at the mercy of whoever tells it for you. The third lesson: vertical integration is a moat. The UFC's decision to own everything, the events, the content, the rights, the brand, rather than franchise it out, created a business that is extraordinarily difficult to replicate. Competitors have tried. Bellator, One Championship, various regional organizations. None of them have come close to the UFC's commercial scale, because none of them have the same depth of control over their entire value chain. In your own business, every time you have the choice between owning something and outsourcing it, think carefully about what that decision means for your long-term leverage and your ability to capture value. And the fourth lesson: one person with a clear vision can change the direction of an entire industry. Dana White is not a fighter. He is not a media executive in the traditional sense. He had no background in broadcasting or sports management before the UFC. What he had was an absolute, unshakable conviction that MMA was the most exciting sport in the world and that the entire world would eventually see it. That conviction, maintained through years of losses, regulatory battles, media hostility, and near bankruptcy, is what built the UFC. Vision, held long enough and executed consistently enough, bends reality. The UFC was banned, ridiculed, and nearly dead. Today, it is a $12 billion empire that changed what the world thinks is possible in sport. And it got there not through luck, not through a single brilliant innovation, but through a relentless, disciplined, strategic accumulation of advantages. One regulatory battle, one broadcast deal, one star, one fight at a time. If this is the kind of story that makes you see business differently, subscribe. Every single week, we go behind the scoreboard and into the real game, the one that decides who builds something that lasts. See you next week.